Pater Deism, Philosophy of Weimar Germany by Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt's Political Theology. This book delves into the nature and power of sovereign political authority in the Western context. It examines the relationship between this authority and Western Christianity and highlights key figures who have shaped this domain. Although not Schmitt's first work, it's often considered an essential introduction to his ideas. Benito Sereno and Sovereignty. Schmitt draws upon Herman Melville's story, Benito Sereno, to illustrate ideas about sovereignty. In the story, Captain Sereno appears to be in control but is actually being manipulated under threat. This serves as a metaphor for the complex and sometimes deceptive nature of political authority. 1. Schmitt's critique of legal formalism. Schmitt argues against the idea that laws can be universally applicable in all situations. He emphasizes that laws are shaped by human actions and situations, which are often unpredictable and unruly. This challenges the notion of a purely rule-based legal system. 2. The concept of sovereignty. Schmitt defines sovereignty as the power to decide in exceptional circumstances. He views politics as distinct from other domains like economics, emphasizing the human and often confrontational nature of political decisions. 3. Sovereignty as a limiting concept. Schmitt sees sovereignty as a concept that highlights the limitations of legal norms. By focusing on the exceptional case, sovereignty reveals the boundaries and the human element inherent in legal and political systems. 4. Human element in politics and law. Schmitt criticizes approaches that remove the human element from political and legal decisions. He argues that human judgment and decision-making are crucial, even in the context of established laws and rules. The depreciation of men. Different metals tells a history, describe different stages or types of human development and understanding, ranging from a deeply enlightened state to a more materialistic and socially driven existence. It reflects on how humanity has changed over time, from being deeply connected with spiritual and philosophical truths to being more enmeshed in societal structures and human-made laws. 1. Gold men. This represents the ideal human being in ancient philosophy. These people are seen as having a natural understanding of divine laws, leading lives filled with deep philosophical and theological thought. Imagine them as wise philosophers or enlightened individuals who live in harmony with the world and have a profound understanding of the mysteries of life. 2. Silver men. These individuals are knowledgeable about ethics, moral principles, and physics, the natural world. They try to understand the divine, or the ultimate truths, through the lens of creation and use science and reason to explore and explain these higher truths. Think of them as scientists or rational thinkers who use their understanding of the natural world to get closer to spiritual or existential truths. 3. Iron men. This represents modern humans. Unlike the gold and silver men, iron men are constrained by human-made laws and societal norms. They often focus on the state or government and are less connected to spiritual or religious experiences. They are described as being unable to see beyond the everyday, tangible world and thus miss out on the miracles or deeper truths of life. 4. Aluminum men. This suggests a possible evolution or ascension of modern men. Perhaps, as humans progress, they might develop new ways of understanding and interacting with the world, transcending the limitations of the iron men. 5. Petro men. This represents a descent or degradation, where people focus primarily on social sciences like sociology, and might be heavily involved in social movements or socialism. This could imply a shift away from individual enlightenment towards a more collective, society-focused mindset. Absolutism and totalitarianism are complex political systems that often emerge during periods of intense national crisis, particularly when the very existence and future of a nation and its people are perceived to be at stake. These systems are characterized by the concentration of all political power in the hands of a single ruler or a small group, who then exercise complete control over the state and its citizens. This phenomenon can be understood in the context of historical events, such as those in Europe during the 1930s. During this era, many European nations, even those considered great powers, faced existential threats. The fear was that the outcome of conflicts, like wars, could determine the fate of nations and their people for generations. The looming possibility of defeat wasn't just about losing territory or sovereignty. It was about the long-term subjugation and control by victorious powers. This fear was not unfounded, considering the aftermath of World War I, known as the Great War. Following World War I, the defeated nations were subjected to heavy reparations and military occupations. These reparations were financial penalties imposed to compensate for the war damages, and they were so burdensome that they affected the economies of these nations for many years, in some cases lingering until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The military occupations involved the presence of foreign troops within a nation, often exerting significant influence over its governance and society. In such high-stakes situations, where the future of a nation and its cultural identity are perceived as being on the line, people often resort to supporting more centralized and authoritarian forms of governance. The rationale behind this support is the belief that strong, decisive leadership is necessary to navigate through crises and safeguard national interests. In this context, every sacrifice, whether in terms of individual freedoms or societal norms, is deemed worthy if it contributes to the nation's survival and independence. Absolutism and totalitarianism, thus, become appealing as they promise a unified and strong response to existential threats, albeit at the cost of democratic values and individual liberties. Political theology encompasses the intricate relationship between religious doctrines and political authority. It reflects a tradition where rulers, such as kings or government officials, often justify their authority through religious or spiritual principles. This notion can be traced back to historical practices where monarchs defended their rule as being aligned with their deity's will, and similarly, chancellors or political leaders justified their legal frameworks as echoing divine or moral orders. Carl Schmitt's perspective on this matter delves into the complex dynamics of law interpretation. He argues that interpreting laws, which he terms as the free deed of legal perception, can elevate a disparate set of laws into a unified and structured system. This process is akin to discerning a coherent pattern or a unifying principle within a collection of diverse and seemingly unrelated regulations, thereby creating order from chaos. However, Schmitt warns of a significant pitfall in this process: the potential erosion of the perceived objectivity within the law. This inherent risk stems from the subjective nature of human interpretation, suggesting that laws, despite their detailed construction, are vulnerable to individual biases and interpretations. Schmitt further posits that as jurisprudence evolves and laws attain a level of clarity and precision reminiscent of natural laws and scientific axioms, an unexpected and paradoxical outcome ensues. Rather than culminating in a more equitable society, the application of these refined laws often becomes increasingly arbitrary. This phenomenon may arise from the heightened role of human interpretation in applying these divine-like laws. In reaction to this trend, human societies often seek equilibrium through alternative forms of understanding and social organization. This tendency towards seeking balance is notably evident in the post-World War II spiritualism movement, spearheaded by figures such as Carl Jung. Jung's theories emphasize the significance of the human psyche and individual spiritual experiences over formalized religious institutions or rigid legal frameworks. This approach resonates with beliefs in Eastern religions, where the sanctity and divinity of humanity and the individual spirit are often placed above gods or celestial entities. This perspective proposes a counterpoint to the rigid enforcement of laws, highlighting the value of personal spiritual experiences and the inherent worth of human life and consciousness against the backdrop of legal or doctrinal rigidity. Democracy, in its essence, is a system of governance driven by the collective will of its people, representing a broad spectrum of society's views and interests. It is, at its core, a human-centric construct, designed to aggregate the diverse opinions and needs of a population. The reference to democracy as the form factor of the least common denominator suggests that it functions by finding a common ground among various groups, often settling on solutions that, while not ideal for all, are acceptable to the majority. However, this democratic process can lead to an evolution towards what are called big tent coalitions. These are political alliances that encompass a wide range of ideologies and beliefs, attempting to cater to as many constituencies as possible. This approach is analogous to a black hole, where the central mass, in this case, the core principles or policies of the coalition, becomes increasingly dense and dominant. As the core of the coalition consolidates, it attracts more members, mass and population, to its center. Conversely, those who find themselves outside of this growing consensus may feel increasingly alienated and marginalized. These outliers, or outcasts, may react by moving faster in the political spectrum, adopting more extreme or revolutionary stances as they find themselves further from the coalition's center. The dynamics within these big tent coalitions often necessitate more cross-the-aisle politics, where members are required to engage with and sometimes compromise with those of differing ideologies to maintain the coalition's unity. This process inevitably leads to the formation of new norms and dogmas within the coalition, as members negotiate and redefine their collective values and policies. Those who enforce these evolving norms can be seen as part of what is described as the radical center, or a radical singularity. These individuals or groups act as inquisitors or guardians of the coalition's new consensus, ensuring adherence to the unified vision of the group. This radical center may promote a singular perspective or ideology that they believe best represents the collective will, emphasizing the importance of one unified mind, will, and national identity. In addressing the nuances of modern social progressivism and conservatism, it's imperative to consider the interplay of scientific understanding, economic accessibility, and the evolution of democratic institutions. Firstly, the common perception that a thorough comprehension of scientific principles is essential for partaking in the benefits of contemporary life warrants re-evaluation. As scientific knowledge becomes increasingly intricate, it surpasses the grasp of even the experts in the field. This evolution has led to the development of technology and scientific products that are designed for user-friendliness, effectively democratizing access to the fruits of scientific progress. Therefore, it is not the depth of one's scientific acumen but rather one's economic capacity that predominantly determines access to a modern lifestyle. Regarding wealth as a determinant factor, it is observed that the primary delineation between a rudimentary existence and a life of suburban comfort is essentially economic. The disparity in access to modern conveniences and a higher standard of living is, thus, more a matter of financial means than of intellectual engagement with the underpinnings of science. When contemplating the historical context of governance, particularly the rule of ancient democratic theologies exemplified by institutions like the Roman papacy, it becomes evident that these structures did not necessarily catalyze the advancement of scientific thought or enlightenment. This observation challenges the notion that the progression towards a more enlightened and scientifically advanced society is inherently linked to specific forms of political governance or ideology. In the realm of modern democracy, the concept of an enlightened science technocracy, where governance is predominantly in the hands of scientific experts, is a subject of debate. It is posited that contemporary democratic societies should not necessarily aspire to this model. Instead, drawing from Carl Schmitt's critique, it is suggested that these societies ought to engage in a deeper exploration and reconnection with their historical and philosophical roots. This approach advocates for a nuanced understanding of democracy that transcends the binary perspectives often associated with modern social progressivism and conservatism, recognizing the multifaceted influences that shape societal progress. 1. Criticism of political economists. Schmitt criticized political economists for their approach to analyzing various societal issues. He argued that these economists attempted to interpret complex social phenomena, such as racial, gender, national, cultural, and psychological dynamics, solely through the lens of economic theory. Schmitt believed this reductionist approach was inadequate because it oversimplified the multifaceted nature of these issues, neglecting the intricate interplay of non-economic factors. 2. Personal definition of evil. The statement, "I hereby define evil as my incapability, so that I can do everything, but I chose to not do evil," presents a unique moral philosophy. It suggests that evil is defined by the failure to act, despite having the will to do so. This viewpoint emphasizes society and morality is here to contain humanity's evil, especially those who are capable of great evil deeds. 3. Law and human development. The concept that men created law yet law also created men reflects a dialectical relationship between law and human nature. It implies that while humans have constructed legal systems, these systems, in turn, have a profound impact on human psychology and behavior. People raised under different legal and environmental conditions will develop distinct psyches, creating a sort of echo chamber, where the legal and cultural environment shapes and reinforces certain beliefs and behaviors across generations. 4. Democracy and theology. The idea that modern democracy has inherited aspects of the theology from absolute monarchies raises questions about the nature of political authority and legitimacy. The speculation about whether marginalized groups in such societies might turn to alternative belief systems, akin to the early adoption of Christianity in Rome, suggests a potential for dissent and the emergence of new ideologies. This hypothesis probes the depth of democratic representation and the possibility of divergent voices seeking solace in alternative belief systems or ideologies. 5. Artificial objectivity of democracy. Describing democracy as artificial objectivity hints at the inherent subjectivity in democratic processes. It implies that while democracy aims to represent the collective will, it often reflects a constructed version of objectivity that may not fully encapsulate the diversity of opinions and perspectives within a society. 6. Political theology and feudalism. The comparison of political theology to a form of resurrected feudalism draws parallels between contemporary political structures and historical forms of governance. The analogy of Jesus as the universal king and the Kaiser as the king of Deutschland, Germany, illustrates how political authority and religious or symbolic leadership can be intertwined, echoing feudal structures where rulers claim divine sanction for their authority. In an era where democracy is increasingly regarded as the ultimate form of political organization or any organizations, even in business and non-profits, understanding its various archetypes becomes crucial. The legacies of early 20th century archetypes. 1. Democracy by one. This archetype centers around the concept of a singular, almost omniscient leader, often referred to as the Holy King. This leader possesses an extraordinary ability to understand and respond to the collective voices and needs of the populace. Unlike a traditional dictator, this leader's authority is derived from the people rather than divinely ordained power. The key here is that the leader's mandate is rooted in the will of the people. A practical example of this might be seen in times of war, where democratic societies sometimes grant extensive powers to a single leader, such as a president or prime minister, who acts as the supreme commander. This concentration of power is often justified as necessary for decisive action and unity of command during crises. 2. Democracy of many. This model is characterized by representative democracy, where the fate of the nation is decided by elected officials. These representatives might come to power through various means: self-creation, emerging due to their ideas and public appeal, inheritance, following in the footsteps of a mentor, or through familial or traditional lineage, or through democratic elections. This system often involves intense political competition, where candidates engage in debates and campaigns to win the trust of the electorate. The ideal in this model is that the best or most capable leaders will emerge victorious. However, there's a critique that sometimes it results in the election of the least common denominator, a candidate who, while not the most capable, is the least offensive or most ideologically stable to the majority. 3. Democracy of majority. This archetype represents a form of democracy that theoretically eliminates barriers to participation, allowing an unfiltered expression of the majority's will. It's a purer form of democracy in theory, but it's also unprecedented and largely untested in practice. The implication is that such a system could lead to entirely new forms of governance and societal organization, as it allows for direct and unmitigated expression of the popular will. However, there's an underlying question about the feasibility and potential outcomes of such a radically inclusive form of democracy, especially considering the complexities and diversities of modern societies. Each of these archetypes offers a different perspective on how democracy can function and the challenges it might face. Democracy by one emphasizes centralized leadership. Democracy of many highlights representative governance with its merits and flaws, and democracy of majority proposes a more direct, yet unexplored, form of democratic participation. Contrary to popular belief, Carl Schmitt is indifferent to democracies but against tyrannies. In the realm of political theory and legal philosophy, Carl Schmitt's contributions provide a profound commentary on the intersections of human nature, societal constructs, and democratic governance. His work critically examines the role of theology and its complex integration into the social fabric, a concept he articulates with keen insight. Schmitt posited that human societies are often inclined towards seeking simplified solutions, a via brevis, to navigate the intricacies of social existence. This inclination leads to the adoption of tools that obviate the need for specialized knowledge, encapsulated in the phrase, scientia specialis non requiratur. In democratic contexts, theology frequently emerges as one such tool, providing a framework for understanding and navigating life without necessitating deep intellectual engagement. This phenomenon is particularly pronounced in democratic societies, in ambitu democratico, where theology offers a readily accessible lens through which individuals can interpret their experiences. Humanity's interaction with theology in societal dynamics, or humanitas et theologia in societatis dynamicis, suggests that human society cannot be wholly governed by theological doctrines, known as theologia, within the fabric of social life, or vita socialis. This is primarily because there exists an inherent quest for simplified solutions, via brevis, to the complexities of societal functioning. People often seek readily accessible tools or methods that do not require specialized knowledge, scientia specialis non requiratur, tools that are easy to understand and apply, even for those without extensive education. The role of theology as a societal tool, theologiae munus ud instrumentum societatis, becomes evident within the democratic milieu, in ambitu democratico. Theology provides a framework for understanding and navigating life's challenges without necessitating deep intellectual engagement. Interestingly, there is a tendency among people to embrace these theological concepts abstractly, abstracta emplecti, and to abandon them when they become inconvenient or burdensome, cum inopportuna fiunt, desirunt. This phenomenon reflects a certain flexibility in how theological beliefs are treated in modern society, distinct from the rigid adherence to traditional dogma, rigida adhesio dogmati tradido. In the context of immanence, pantheism, and spiritualism, immanentia, pantheismus, et spiritualismus, this aspect of societal dynamics becomes particularly intriguing. These beliefs emphasize the presence of divinity in all aspects of the natural world and the importance of personal spiritual experiences. It is often in times of great distress or dire need, in temporibus angusties, that groups turn to ideologies like Marxism, seeking systemic explanations and solutions, while individuals might turn to personal theology or spiritual beliefs for guidance and solace. The transition from absolutism to democratic law, a absolutismo ad legem democraticum transition, implies that it is improbable for a nation to completely abandon the absolute authority traditionally held by kings and sovereigns, auctoritas absoluta regum et dominorum. Such a deep-rooted influence of these forms of governance suggests that a society that has never faced extreme adversity, societas numquam maxima adversitate affecta, may not fully relinquish these older, more centralized forms of rule. The transformation of public law into positive law, lex positiva et auctoritas regnans, highlights a shift where the law becomes an expression of the will of the ruling class, voluntas classis regnantis. This is encapsulated in the phrase, auctoritas non veritas facit legem, meaning, authority, not truth, makes the law. It signifies a potential departure from the ideal of law as a manifestation of objective truth, instead becoming a tool wielded by those in power. Carl Schmitt presents the base of modern American analysis of the metamorphosis of human understanding, the dynamics of political structures, and the intricate links between law, theology, and democracy, providing critical insights into societal evolution and governance. In times of greatest need, the collective turns to Marxism, the solitary to theology. A nation untouched by true adversity relinquishes kingly absolutism without struggle. On the counter-revolutionary philosophy of the state, de Maistre, Bonald, de Nosso Cortes, German Romantics exhibited a peculiar characteristic: perpetual dialogue. Novalis and Adam Muller thrived in this milieu, viewing it as the ultimate expression of their intellectual essence. Catholic political philosophers like de Maistre, Bonald, and de Nosso Cortes, labeled Romantics in Germany due to their conservative or reactionary stance and idealization of medieval conditions, would have deemed such endless discourse a product of macabre, whimsical fantasy. Their counter-revolutionary political philosophy was underpinned by the recognition that their era demanded decisive action. Between the two revolutionary epochs of 1789 and 1848, they placed the concept of decision-making at the forefront of their thought. Wherever 19th-century Catholic philosophy was engaged, it echoed the sentiment that a critical juncture had been reached, one that precluded any synthesis. Cardinal Newman asserted a stark dichotomy: Catholicity versus atheism, with no middle ground. Each thinker framed a stark either-or scenario, echoing more the tones of dictatorship than endless discourse. The Restoration countered the activist ethos of the French Revolution with notions of tradition and custom, and a belief in slow historical progression. Such ideas could have led to a complete denial of natural reason and an absolute moralistic passivity, deeming any action inherently evil. Traditionalism, theological, refuted by J. Lupus and P. Chastel, the latter referring to the German sentimentalism as the source of such errors, in its extreme form, represented an irrational rejection of all conscious intellectual decisions. However, Bonald, the founder of traditionalism, diverged from the notion of self-propelled evolution. His intellectual framework differed markedly from de Maistre's or de Nosso Cortes. Bonald often displayed a surprisingly Germanic perspective, yet his faith in tradition did not morph into ideologies like Schelling's nature philosophy, Adam Muller's synthesis of opposites, or Hegel's historical belief. For Bonald, tradition was the only means to access metaphysical content, as he viewed individual intellect as too frail and pitiable to discern truth autonomously. This contrasts sharply with the approaches of the aforementioned three Germans, particularly in Bonald's grim view of humanity's historical trajectory: a procession of blind men led by a blind man, feeling his way with a cane. Bonald's fondness for antitheses and distinctions, which earned him the moniker of a scholastic, in truth represented moral bifurcations, not the polarities in Schelling's natural philosophy. On the counter-revolutionary philosophy of the state, these bifurcations exposed not just indifference points, or simple dialectical negations of historical progression, but stark contrasts between good and evil, God and the devil, with a decisive life and death struggle that rejected any synthesis or higher third. De Maistre's emphasis on sovereignty, equating essentially to decision-making, highlighted the state's function in providing decisive action, and the Church's role in rendering ultimate, unappealable decisions. For him, infallibility epitomized the irrevocable decision, paralleling the sovereignty in state governance. In his view, every exercise of sovereignty acted as though infallible, every government was absolute, a notion even an anarchist might echo, albeit with a drastically different intent. This concept forms a stark antithesis in political thought history: the axiom of good people, corruptible magistrate, in anarchism versus de Maistre's belief in the inherent goodness of established authority. Any government is good once it is established. This highlights the importance he placed on decision-making itself, valuing the act of decision over its content. The critical aspect was not the possibility of error, but the absence of a higher authority to challenge the decision. As revolutionary radicalism deepened in the 1848 Proletarian Revolution compared to the 1789 Third Estate Revolution, so did the counter-revolutionaries' emphasis on decision-making. Understanding this shift is key to grasping the evolution from de Maistre to de Nosso Cortes, from legitimacy to dictatorship. This intensification manifested in the increasingly central axiomatic theses on human nature. Every political ideology, in one way or another, positions itself on the spectrum of human nature, inherently good or inherently evil. The Enlightenment rationalists viewed man as naturally ignorant and coarse, but capable of education. This view underpinned the notion of legal despotism, an educated humanity shaped by a legislative authority. Rousseau believes this could change the nature of man, for unruly nature subdued by Fichte's tyrant, transforming the state into an educational factory. Marxist socialism considered human nature's question irrelevant, believing economic and social changes would transform humanity. Committed atheistic anarchists saw man as fundamentally good, with all evil stemming from theological thought and its derivatives, including all concepts of authority, state, and government. In contrast, Donoso Cortés, opposing Proudhon's anti-theological anarchism, started from the Catholic doctrine of original sin, polemically radicalizing it into a doctrine of absolute human sinfulness and depravity. This differed from the Lutheran interpretation of the doctrine, which, contrary to the Council of Trent's assertion of distortion or injury, posited a natural good. Abbé Gaduel's criticism of Donoso Cortés for exaggerating man's natural evil was valid, yet it overlooked the pressing religious and political significance of Donoso Cortés' stance. When he spoke of man's natural evil, he was countering atheist anarchism's axiom of the good man. He was driven by concerns and not dogmatics. Despite seemingly aligning with Lutheran dogma, his stance diverged from the Lutheran obedience mandate to every authority, retaining the grandeur of a spiritual descendant of the Grand Inquisitors. Donoso Cortés' views on human depravity were more extreme than any absolutist state philosophy, surpassing even de Maistre's shock at human wickedness and Ronald's clarity on the fundamentally evil human instinct. His contempt for humanity knew no bounds. Man's blind reason, weak will, and the laughable vitality of his carnal desires appeared so pitiable that no language could adequately express his lowliness. His understanding of sin was universal, exceeding even puritanical horror. The starkness of his views equated the optimism of Russian anarchists who proclaimed human goodness with the grimness of the Spanish Catholic who doubted such self-assured goodness without divine affirmation. Donoso Cortés' despair, as evident in his correspondence with Count Raczewski, bordered on madness. His historical philosophy saw the triumph of evil as inevitable, only a divine miracle could avert it. His view of human history was filled with dread and horror, humanity blindly staggering through the labyrinth of history, whose layout is unknown, humanity as a rudderless ship tossed on the sea, manned by a mutinous, ignorant crew, destined to be swept away by divine wrath to restore tranquility. However, the most vivid image he painted was of the ongoing bloody conflict between Catholicism and atheist socialism. According to Donoso Cortés, bourgeois liberalism's hallmark was its refusal to take a stand in this conflict, instead opting for discussion. He defined the bourgeoisie as a discussing class, una clase discutidora, doomed by its aversion to decisive action. This characterization captured the class's tendency to shift political activity to the realms of media and parliamentary debate, rendering it ineffective in social conflict. The insecurity and immaturity of the liberal bourgeoisie during the July monarchy were evident everywhere. Its constitutional liberalism sought to constrain the king through parliament while allowing him to retain the throne, a contradiction mirrored in deism's removal of God from worldly affairs while affirming his existence. This inconsistency in liberalism was noted not only by reactionaries like Donoso Cortés and F.J. Stahl but also by revolutionaries like Marx and Engels. Here, a rare opportunity arises to juxtapose a bourgeois German scholar of Hegelian education with a Spanish Catholic, both diagnosing the same liberal inconsistencies yet arriving at different evaluations, offering a typologically clear contrast. In his Geschichte der sozialen Bewegung in Frankreich, Lorenz von Stein detailed the liberals' paradoxes, desiring a monarch as a supreme personal authority yet reducing him to a mere executive organ, wanting a king above party politics yet dependent on the people's assembly, declaring the king inviolable but binding him to a constitutional oath, creating a conceptual contradiction that no human ingenuity could resolve. F.J. Stahl, a Prussian conservative, offered a simpler explanation. Liberals oscillated between leftward hatred of monarchy and aristocracy and rightward fear of dispossession by radical democracy and socialism, trying to deceive both. Stein, however, attributed these contradictions to life's complexity, where the interplay of opposing forces characterizes all living things, including the state. De Maistre and Donoso Cortes were incapable of such organic thinking. De Maistre showed this through his incomprehension of Schelling's philosophy of life. Donoso Cortes was horrified when confronted with Hegelianism in Berlin in 1849. Both diplomats and politicians, well versed in their fields, had reached practical compromises, yet the idea of a systematic and metaphysical compromise was beyond their grasp. They saw deferring decisions at critical junctures, by denying any need for decision, as a peculiar blend of confusion, perhaps with pantheistic undertones. For Donoso Cortes, liberalism, characterized by its contradictions and compromises, was merely a transient phase, where dilemmas like Christ or Barabbas were met with calls for postponement or investigative commissions. This stance wasn't random but stemmed from the underlying liberal metaphysics. The bourgeoisie, champions of free speech and press, didn't adopt these freedoms through arbitrary psychological or economic conditions but through a historical process, with roots traced back to North American states. Georg Jelinek's revelation of this American origin was unsurprising to thinkers like the Catholic philosopher of the state or Karl Marx. Furthermore, economic concepts like free trade are merely offshoots of a deeper metaphysical foundation. Donoso Cortes, with his sharp intellect, perceived only the theological aspects of his opponents. His approach was clear-cut, devoid of mystical ambiguity, as evidenced in his letters on political matters. His insights, like defining the bourgeoisie as a class obsessed with discussion and recognizing their devotion to free speech, were astute. This doesn't encapsulate all aspects of continental liberalism, but it's a significant observation. The essence of liberalism is negotiation and compromise, avoiding definitive confrontations in favor of perpetual debate. In contrast, dictatorship is about decisiveness, an approach exemplified by Donoso Cortes, who anticipated extreme scenarios, respecting atheistic socialism as a formidable enemy. Proudhon, for instance, was seen as demonic, a view that reflected the intellectual climate of the era. This stance, however, was flawed as it merely inverted rules between God and the devil. Later anarchists like Bakunin pursued a more consistent stance against theology, advocating for a naturalistic view of life. Bakunin's rejection of theological doctrines aimed at freeing humanity from artificial moral constraints, seeing them as tools for power and domination. In contemporary times, the political realm is under attack, with various groups, from financiers to Marxists, advocating for the removal of political biases in favor of economic or technical management. Modern thought struggles to grasp political ideas, often reducing them to economic interests. The counter-revolutionary philosophers' significance lies in their focus on decisive action. When Donoso Cortes realized the era of traditional monarchy was ending, he called for a political dictatorship, turning away from the principle of legitimacy. This shift to decisionism essentially favored dictatorship over legitimacy. Donoso Cortes, recognizing the imminent last battle, saw dictatorship as the only solution to radical evil. This perspective sets up a clear opposition between authority and anarchy, each absolute in its decisiveness. This radical dichotomy compels even anarchists, who oppose all forms of government, to confront the paradox of opposing decision-making itself. This leads to the peculiar situation where Bakunin, a prominent anarchist, paradoxically adopts a theoretical and practical stance akin to that of a theologian and dictator, opposing theology and dictatorship. The concept of sovereignty in the thought of Carl Schmitt, sovereignty, a cornerstone of political and legal theory, has undergone substantial evolution and reinterpretation since its formal inception in the 16th century. This intricate concept, central to understanding the nature and function of states and law, offers a lens through which to view the shifting landscape of political power and legal authority. Origins and historical development of sovereignty. Jean Bodin, a French jurist and philosopher, as often credited with formally introducing the concept of sovereignty in the late 16th century. Boden's concept of sovereignty emerged during a time marked by the gradual dissolution of feudal structures and the rise of centralized nation-states. This transformation was part of the broader socio-political shift in Europe, where the power dynamics were moving away from feudal lords and towards absolute monarchs. Boden's definition of sovereignty was tied to the authority of the state, which he saw as the ultimate holder of power, free from the constraints of any other authority, be it internal or external. This notion of absolute and indivisible power was revolutionary. It was a response to the fragmented political authority typical of the feudal era and provided a theoretical foundation for the emerging structure of the nation-state. Sovereignty in the context of nation-states. The development of nation-states in Europe further refined the concept of sovereignty. As states sought to solidify their power and establish their authority, sovereignty became a critical tool in defining and defending their autonomy and independence, both domestically and in international relations. In this context, sovereignty came to be understood as the legal and political authority of a state to govern itself without external interference. This included the authority to create and enforce laws, administer justice, and control its territory and population. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, is often cited as a key moment in solidifying the principles of state sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Sovereignty and legal formalism. Schmitt highlights the tension between legal formalism and the socio-political realities that influence legal thought. Legal formalism, in the context of sovereignty, refers to an approach that emphasizes the importance of legal rules and structures in understanding and defining sovereignty. This perspective seeks to achieve scientific objectivity by focusing on the formal qualities of legal systems and downplaying the influence of political and social factors. However, critics of legal formalism argue that this approach can be overly rigid and may fail to account for the dynamic nature of political power and the real-world implications of legal decisions. This debate reflects a broader tension in legal and political theory between abstract principles and practical realities. The rule of international law. The concept of sovereignty is also crucial in the realm of international law. Émeric de Vattel, an 18th-century Swiss philosopher and legal theorist, contributed significantly to the development of international law, particularly in his work, The Law of Nations. Vattel's understanding of sovereignty was grounded in the context of international relations, where states interact as equals, each possessing sovereignty over its territory and affairs. In this international context, sovereignty serves as a foundational principle that governs the relationships between states. It underpins the legal frameworks that regulate interactions among states, including treaties, diplomatic relations, and international agreements. Kelson's legal theory and the concept of sovereignty. Hans Kelsen, a prominent legal theorist of the 20th century, offered a distinct perspective on sovereignty. Kelson's theory sought to purify the concept of sovereignty from sociological elements, focusing instead on a hierarchical system of legal norms. He argued that the state should be understood not as a concrete entity but as a system of legal norms, with sovereignty lying in the highest norm from which all other norms derive their authority. Kelson's approach represents a shift towards a more abstract, normative understanding of sovereignty, one that emphasizes the logical structure of legal systems rather than their socio-political context. This perspective has been influential in the development of modern legal theory, but it has also faced criticism for its perceived detachment from the realities of political power and social dynamics. The decisionist perspective on sovereignty. The decisionist perspective, as exemplified by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, emphasizes the role of decision-making in the concept of sovereignty. This perspective views sovereignty not just as a set of abstract legal principles but as the concrete authority to make decisions, particularly in situations where legal norms may be ambiguous or insufficient. Hobbes, in his seminal work, Leviathan, argued that the essence of sovereignty lies in the absolute authority of the sovereign to make decisions on behalf of the state. This authority, according to Hobbes, is necessary to prevent the chaos and disorder that would arise in its absence. The decisionist perspective highlights the importance of the authority and autonomy of the sovereign in ensuring the stability and order of the state. Contrasting views on sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty has been subject to various interpretations and debates. For instance, some theorists, like Crabbe and Gierke, have challenged traditional notions of sovereignty by emphasizing the rule of law and community in defining and limiting state power. These perspectives reflect a move away from the idea of absolute, centralized authority and towards a more distributed and participatory understanding of sovereignty. The liberal constitutional tradition of the 19th century, with its emphasis on the rule of law and the separation of powers, also contributed to reshaping the concept of sovereignty. In this tradition, sovereignty is seen as residing not in a single ruler or institution but in the legal system as a whole, which is grounded in principles of democracy, rights, and justice. Sovereignty and the juristic form. Schmitt also delves into the nature of the juristic form in relation to sovereignty. This perspective emphasizes the unique role of legal form in applying and realizing legal principles. Unlike technical or aesthetic forms, the juristic form is concerned with the application of law to concrete situations, requiring a combination of legal reasoning and decision-making authority. This understanding of the juristic form highlights the dynamic and contextual nature of legal application. It recognizes that the realization of legal principles involves more than just the mechanical application of rules. It requires a process of interpretation and decision-making that is inherently tied to the authority and competence of the decision-maker. Contemporary relevance of sovereignty. In the contemporary world, the concept of sovereignty remains central to discussions of international relations, state authority, and the nature of law. The challenges of globalization, the rise of supranational organizations, and the increasing interconnectedness of the world have raised new questions about the nature and limits of state sovereignty. Issues such as human rights, environmental protection, and global trade have highlighted the tension between state sovereignty and the need for international cooperation and regulation. As states navigate these complex issues, the concept of sovereignty continues to evolve, reflecting the changing landscape of global politics and law. Schmitt's analysis of sovereignty pivots on the assertion that sovereign is he who decides on the exception. This statement encapsulates a central tenet of political theory, emphasizing the ultimate authority of a sovereign entity to transcend the normative legal order in times of exceptional circumstances. Schmitt's definition challenges conventional understandings of sovereignty, which often align with ideas of absolute power or supreme authority within a given territory. Instead, he posits sovereignty as an inherently dynamic and situational concept, linked intrinsically to the capacity to address exceptions or emergencies that lie beyond the scope of standard legal frameworks. This approach diverges significantly from more static, legalistic definitions of sovereignty, which tend to focus on sovereignty as a formal attribute of states or rulers. To appreciate Schmitt's perspective, it is necessary to delve into the historical and philosophical contexts from which his ideas emerged. His work, deeply influenced by the turbulent political landscape of early 20th century Europe, reflects an era marked by extraordinary upheavals, where the traditional order was frequently disrupted by crises, wars, and revolutions. This backdrop is crucial for understanding why Schmitt places such emphasis on the exception as a defining element of sovereignty. Schmitt's argument hinges on the idea that legal norms are inherently inadequate to address truly exceptional situations, such as severe political or economic crises. In such moments, the decision of whether and how to suspend the existing legal order falls to the sovereign. This act of deciding on the exception embodies the essence of sovereignty. It is a demonstration of authority that is not merely supreme but also fundamentally independent from the established legal order. The notion of the exception is also pivotal in understanding the relationship between sovereignty and the rule of law. Schmitt suggests that in normal circumstances, the law functions within a predefined, stable framework. However, when an exception arises, an event or circumstance that cannot be anticipated or comprehensively regulated by existing laws, the sovereign's decision becomes the law. This decision, which often entails suspending or overriding conventional legal norms, underscores the limitations of the legal order and highlights the sovereign's unique position. Schmitt's analysis also implicates broader philosophical and historical questions about the nature and evolution of political authority. His concept of sovereignty as decision-making power in the face of exception intersects with historical debates about the origins and legitimacy of political power. For instance, his ideas resonate with those of Jean Bodin, a 16th-century French jurist and philosopher, who emphasized the inseparability of sovereignty from the ability to make final decisions, especially in times of crisis. Furthermore, Schmitt's theory offers a critical lens for examining modern constitutional developments, where the trend has generally been towards limiting or diffusing sovereign power. This trend reflects a shift towards liberal democratic principles, emphasizing checks and balances, the rule of law, and human rights. However, Schmitt cautions against the assumption that the need for sovereign decisions in exceptional circumstances can be entirely eliminated or fully regulated within the constitutional framework. The relevance of Schmitt's theory extends beyond historical and theoretical analyses to contemporary political and legal discourse. In an era characterized by globalized interactions, transnational challenges, and complex emergencies, the question of sovereignty remains as pertinent as ever. The ability of states or international bodies to respond effectively to extraordinary events, such as global pandemics, financial crises, or large-scale conflicts, continues to test the limits of legal norms and raises profound questions about the nature and exercise of sovereign power. In conclusion, sovereignty is a multifaceted and evolving concept that sits at the heart of political and legal theory. From its origins in the writings of Bodin and Hobbes to contemporary debates in international law and global governance, the concept of sovereignty has been shaped by a myriad of factors, including historical developments, philosophical perspectives, and practical political considerations. Understanding sovereignty requires not only a grasp of legal and political principles but also an appreciation of the complex interplay between abstract theory and real-world dynamics. Sovereignty in the 20th century experienced profound transformations, reflecting the dynamic interplay between political power, legal authority, and social change. This period witnessed the erosion of absolute sovereignty and the emergence of complex, multi-layered governance structures that challenged traditional notions of state power. 1. Challenges to sovereign authority. The 20th century saw significant challenges to the traditional concept of sovereignty. 2 world wars, the decolonization movement, the rise of supranational organizations like the United Nations, and the emergence of human rights as a global norm all played a role in reshaping the understanding of sovereign power. The sovereignty of nation-states was no longer seen as absolute but subject to international law and norms. 2. Redefinition in international law. The establishment of international bodies and treaties, such as the United Nations Charter and the Geneva Conventions, introduced new frameworks for understanding sovereignty. Sovereignty began to be seen not just as a right but also as a responsibility, with the international community increasingly recognizing the concept of responsibility to protect, which suggests that sovereignty is contingent on states' abilities to protect their citizens. 3. Impact of globalization. Globalization further complicated the concept of sovereignty. The increasing interconnectedness of the world's economies, cultures, and political systems led to a situation where domestic policies were often influenced by global factors, challenging the traditional notion of sovereign states as isolated and autonomous entities. 4. Decolonization and the Third World. The decolonization process led to the creation of new states, which often struggled with the legacy of colonialism. These states faced challenges in establishing effective sovereignty due to internal conflicts, economic dependencies, and external interventions. 5. Human rights and sovereignty. The rise of human rights as a global norm presented a challenge to the concept of absolute sovereignty. International human rights laws and conventions, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, posited that state sovereignty could be overruled in cases of serious human rights violations. 6. Economic sovereignty. The increasing influence of multinational corporations and international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank raised questions about economic sovereignty. Many states found their economic policies and practices constrained by global market forces and international agreements. 7. Terrorism and non-state actors. The rise of terrorism and powerful non-state actors challenged the state-centric model of sovereignty. States had to navigate complex legal and moral terrains in responding to threats that did not conform to traditional models of state conflict. Hope you enjoy the program. This Peace, Love, Truth Productions.
Boom! Until our narratives intertwine once more, I remain Tim. Wishing you insightful journeys. Brace for tomorrow, for with it comes another chapter in the annals of Treacle of Peace and the Reactionaries. Farewell until we reconvene.